We'll move on to the lesson, officially starting white magic lesson, moving on to Rule 12. Rule 12 reads as follows. Let me move my camera a little bit closer here. The web pulsates. It contracts and expands. Let the magician seize a midway point and thus release the prisoners of the planet whose note is right and justly tuned to that which must be made. Now he says these rules of white magic, the first ones dealt with spiritual and astral levels, and now we get down to the physical level. That once a person begins to manifest in the physical, then he has a responsibility to become a savior, so to speak. And this is one of the basic teachings of Christ, is what I have done, you are supposed to do also. You're supposed to be like me and follow my example. And his example was to be a savior. And there's actually a scriptures that says that saviors, plural, will come upon Mount Zion. So in other words, Jesus isn't the only Savior. He's the only Christ, but we're all supposed to be Christ and reach out and take those who do not have everything that we have on the spiritual level and pull them up to where we are. This is the eternal chain. And this is what the highest lives in the universe are doing, as well as us here are supposed to do, is we all reach out to those that do not have what we have and give them what we have and pull them up. And when we do that, what happens to us? Someone higher than us will reach down and pull us up. And without that link, we're stopped in our progression. And this is what real damnation is described in the scriptures. When you're damned, it's like water in a dam that isn't able to overflow. True damnation is when a person's progression is stopped because he doesn't apply the Christ principle. When he doesn't apply the Christ principle, it means he just wants to move on and go back to God or go to a source, or maybe he turns on the dark path and is just in it for selfishness. And he does not care about lifting his brother or sister up to where he is. He only cares about his own progression, and thus he is damned. In other words, because he's not lifting someone else up, no one lifts him up. And so his progression is stopped or damned. And that's the true meaning of what damnation is. Okay, we'll move along here. The Rule 12 covers two different sections. One is interludes and cycles, and the second is the prisoners of the planet, which is an interesting phrase that we'll talk about later. He talks quite a bit about interludes and cycles. Now, the interludes comes, the most prominent, well-known interludes is in the breath itself. And in the breath, you have the breathing in, you breathe in, and then you can hold the breath. And then you can breathe out, and you can have another interlude. Now, the typical breath, there's very little interlude. Many people have no interludes at all in their breath. But for disciples, it's important that they recognize the interludes, the physical interludes in the breath. The interludes in the breath, the first interlude in the breath, when you breathe in, you feel yourself connecting, visualizing a connection to the higher self. And then during the first interlude, you visualize receiving inspiration from the higher self. And then when you breathe out, you see this materializing. And then in the second interlude, it's concretizing that which was received. Now, he talks about the dark brothers, and the dark side does not use the higher interlude. They only use the lower interlude, and in this they can produce dark magic. The same principle applies with both, except the white magician uses both interludes, whereas the dark magician just uses the one interlude. But the interesting thing he says here is that many of the principles used by both the dark and the light magicians are the same, except the dark ones use an incomplete set of the rules, but what they use are incorporated in the white magician also. But the white magician, the biggest difference is the use of the first interlude that connects to the soul. Okay, I know that Stacy's done some study of the interludes. He's mentioned it before. Do you have any comments on the interludes as far as what you've learned about them, Stacy? Where is Stacy?
I think he might be having computer issues, JJ.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, he can make some comment later on then.
Okay.
Okay.
I mentioned last time that it was like the when you strike a note, it creates a reflection of itself within the thing you struck, and so it makes standing waves. There's like the actual wave is just standing there like little hills, and where there's no wave they call a node, and you can grab it right there and it won't stop the note from ringing.
Yeah, it's interesting, and he talks about sound and creation more as we go along, which is pretty fascinating. Now he makes this point. He says, "Now everything we've talked about so far hasn't included the actual manifestation of things." He says, "But when we get down to the physical creation," he says, "we're dealing more with theory. We have to actually apply skill and real work to finish off the creation that's involved in white magic. The work of manifestation," he says, "is easier under rays 3, 5, and 7. The fifth ray, he says, is passing out, but its influence can still be felt. Fifth ray is like concrete knowledge, like governed science and things like that." He says the third ray is a full meridian, and the seventh ray is rapidly coming into right activity. The seventh ray is a synthetic ray that governs ceremony and order. Business is on the seventh ray, and this is the main ray governing the age of Aquarius, which age of Aquarius is governed by the planet Uranus, which is also governed by the seventh ray. The seventh ray coming in will bring in many new creations. Now, we can see that this is true. This was written in 1934, and he talks about many new creations and inventions and innovations will occur with the seventh ray energy. And look how much the world has changed since 1934. 1934, the biggest source of entertainment was listening to the Amos and Andy on the radio or whatever, you know. Or this. I remember when I was a kid in early 50s, the biggest hit of the week was listening to the Shadow Knows on the radio. We all gathered around the radio and listened to that. And think of how much just entertainment is different, let alone everything else. So his predictions certainly come true about the great innovations since that time. But all these innovations are both good and bad in the fact that a lot of people complain that even though Facebook and the internet bring them in contact with all kinds of more people than they could imagine, that a lot of people are feeling lonelier than than the past generations felt. Why do you think that is? Why do people still feel lonely and isolated when we have much more communication now than before? Any ideas on that?
Personal contact and personal interaction is far better than seeing someone on the screen or on the computer.
I don't know, Ed. I feel pretty enlightened just watching you here. Anyway, yeah, you're right, Ed, that there's something about personal contact. A person should have a degree of personal contact to keep his kind of, there's a certain type of energy you get from that personal contact, which is good, that we need to keep in our lives. And another problem is when people get on Facebook and stuff, it looks like everybody else is having a better time than they are in their mind. And this, they say, creates a big problem for people. It's not so much the lack of contact, it's that they see everybody posting pictures and they're smiling, they're happy, or going on vacation or traveling. And what is the average guy doing? Not much. So he feels like he's being left out. So it's good and bad. For me personally, I really like the contact through the internet because it gives you a lot more opportunity than we had in the old days. But what's interesting, one thing I find interesting though is when I was in the Mormon church, I was really curious as to why in the early days of the Mormon church, the successful missionaries baptized hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, just brought in people with tremendous amounts, whereas in modern times, not only in the church, but outside the church, anything you want to do seems to take a tremendous effort to get 2-3 people interested in an idea. And I used to wonder why that was. And then I started thinking about it. Now, here's what those early Mormon missionaries did. They went into a town, and there was a center in the town where you posted bulletins, okay? So they just took a sheet of paper and they posted, having a meeting 7 o'clock Thursday night or whatever. And by the Mormon missionaries, well, this Mormon's going to speak. Well, back in those days, the word Mormon got circulated. Everybody knew the Mormons were in league with the devil, so people were kind of curious. Now, think of the average person that lived in these frontier towns. What did they do for entertainment? They had no TV, no radio, no nothing. Most people didn't even have a newspaper. And so for entertainment, they said, well, what's going on this week? So they go to the center of town where this bulletin was, and there was maybe 1 or 2 things going on. Maybe somebody was having a potluck party or something like that, but then they noticed some Mormon guys coming to town. Oh, I had to go see him. So what happened is because there was such a famine of entertainment back in those days, this Mormon missionary comes to town and half the people would show up. Half the whole town would show up. And then he would preach to them and he'd make a number of converts and move on to the next town. And so what I found fascinating about this is that even though the communication was just down to 0 compared to today, these guys were able to have much more success because they become the entertainment entertainment for the town. But now look, we turn on our computer to Facebook or wherever we want to go, and YouTube. There's so much to get your attention. I mean, just go to YouTube and type in UFOs, for instance, and you'll come up with all kinds of hundreds of different places to go that are pretty fascinating. Or type in the word time travel. You know,
if you go to YouTube very much, they already know what you like.
right, and they give suggestions. And yeah, you look at that screen on the right, there are suggestions. I mean, once you start, you can just spend the whole night there just going from one thing to another. And, and there's so much competition that you wonder, let's suppose the Christ returned tomorrow, and he says, well, you know, how am I going to get people's attention here? I know, I'm going to make a video on YouTube. And so he makes a video, here I am, I'm back, and I'm going to do some actual miracles. So he does some miracles and changes water to wine and stuff. And few people look at it and say, oh, that's kind of interesting, let's move. Oh, this is a better one. This guy who had a talk with alien, I'm going to go over to him. So this is one thing DK talks about with the return of Christ. He says it's weighing heavy upon him about how he's going to go about his second coming, because how he's going to accomplish that is just a major endeavor, and it's going to take extremely high intelligence to pull it off.
He's got to be a rock star, basically.
So how's he going to do it? How's he going to get people's attention? So the problem we have compared to way back in the frontier West, when people would attend almost anything because there wasn't very much going on for entertainment. Now there's so much to competition for our attention that you wonder if even Christ were here, could he get our attention? And what does get our attention? What gets our attention is when the media decides it's worthy of our attention, then it throws it in front of us. Like this Greta gal that's teaching about climate change. She couldn't get anywhere, and all of a sudden the media decided, hey, this would be a good person to throw in front of the public. And so the media thought this would be an ideal person to promote. So the media promotes her, and now she's everywhere. And so the media is kind of the thing that decides what we see and what we don't see these days. In the old days, it was largely up to the innovative individuals. Now it's up to the media. If they decide it's something that's good for us, they will throw it at us. But there are many great things that are happening that the media doesn't think is important, that are not thrown into the public consciousness the way they should be. And this will be an important thing to consider. Now he comments on the phrase, the web pulsates, it contracts and expands. This refers to cycles of work and rest, inactivity, night and day, speech and silence. We have all these dualities involved in the cycle. And he points out the worker needs to go with the flows of the cycles for the best results. So what we have to look at is, in any work, we're endeavoring to look at the cycles. Now, this can be a business, this can be maybe your goals in life, your personal hobbies, your personal aspirations. They all go in cycles. There's cycles where you reflect and learn, and then there's cycles where you have extra energy to labor. So what we want to look at in any endeavor, especially involving the light and the work of the hierarchy, is this a cycle where I'm supposed to be taking in things and preparing? Or is this a cycle where I'm supposed to be really like working and getting out there and doing stuff? And if it's a cycle of labor, then it will be easier to labor. If it's a cycle of reflection, then it will be easier to learn. Now, he points out also that the more highly evolved the person is, the more he can use these cycles, and he can rest in a cycle of labor or labor in a cycle of reflection to a degree, depending on what is necessary. That the more highly evolved people can use the energies of both cycles to move the work forward. And whereas the average person just kind of goes with the flow pretty much. And his going with the flow is he doesn't use the flow the way that he could. And this is important for the disciples to learn, is to use the flow to their advantage. He says this entire rule might be given in the following paraphrase, which will merit careful thought, and which he will elucidate as follows. And he says this: God breathes, and his pulsating life emanates from the divine heart and manifests as the vital energy of all forms. It flows, pulsating in its cycles throughout all nature. This constitutes the divine inhalation and exhalation. Between this breathing out and the breathing in comes a period of silence and a moment for effective work. If disciples learn to utilize these interludes, they can then release the prisoners of the planet, which is the objective of all magical work performed during this world period. And the prisoners of the planet, we'll get into this in more detail, are basically all lives confined in form. And this particularly applies to all the kingdoms below the human and also the human. We're confined in form of a physical body right now. And so we are part of the prisoners of the planet. And to escape being a prisoner of the planet, the spirit has to transcend the form it's in. So the form is no longer a limitation to spirit. But we've limited ourselves on purpose so that we can have experience and learn all there is to learn from the material world. He says that all the higher lives make use of the interludes, and so must we. And these interludes fall into three categories. One, after death, union with the soul. Generally, the little evolved, he says, rush back into incarnation. But when the soul spends more time out of incarnation than in, he is more contemplative than while in the physical. So the little evolved rush in and out of incarnation. The higher evolved normally take longer periods of time of reflection. And if the entity takes more time out of incarnation than in, then it'll be easier to focus on spirit when he's in incarnation. Now, this isn't a hard, fast rule. Sometimes the more highly evolved will jump right back in because they have a particular mission to finish off. And so there's no really hard, fast rule, but also the fact that we have more opportunity for incarnation now than ever because we have 7 billion people on the planet. And so the interlude between incarnations is less. And so he says the average physical person just goes with the flow. Whereas what we should do between incarnations is take the necessary time to reflect so that we can um, make use of our next life. He says this is one of the problems with the big population increase we're having, is people are having less time in between incarnations to reflect. And this is one of the reasons we have many of the problems we have in the world today, is people that have incarnated haven't had enough time in between incarnations to reflect. This period of reflection, this interlude, is really important. And just the interludes between death and life is one of the important ones in the life of the soul. Second category, he says, the ebb and flow of daily living of a particular incarnation will also demonstrate its interludes, and these aspirant has to learn and recognize. The disciple must learn to recognize the cycles of his life, different periods of influence, different people. Now, there's different interludes, he says, cycles for different people. He says some people have cycles of 7 years, some 9, some 11, and some shorter still. So what we have to do is look on our lives. Now, he also talks about 10-year cycles that every disciple should reflect over the past 10 years and see how things are different in your life now compared to 10 years ago. Now, for some people, it's important to reflect on 7 years or 9 years. Kind of look at your life and see where your cycles have been. 7 years is a common cycle, and 10 years is a common cycle. So look and see where your cycles have been. And then he says, use your cycles, because you'll have cycles where you are strong with receiving, and other cycles where you're strong in sending out and doing things. Ask yourself, which cycle am I in right now? Yeah,
there was a study done. There was a psychological study done, and they found out that people generally every 10 years, they look back on their life and they'll either go into a depression or they'll go forward with life. But they look back on their life of the last 10 years, they're usually disappointed with what they've accomplished. And it's like a every 10-year cycle. And I look back on it, I did it when I was 30 and 40 and 50. And then I learned about it after I was 50, and it actually plays. But every 10 years, people look back on their life.
Yeah, what's interesting as you get older is when you're young, you're just enthused and you're making a lot of changes, and these cycles are really important when you're young, but you have less knowledge of how to apply them. And then as you get older, the cycles, we tend to crystallize more, so it takes more willpower to take advantage of the cycles as we age, because as you age, you tend to get fixed on certain routines and everything. And so we have to kind of, just like as you get older, you need more, to take more effort to exercise, for instance. It takes more effort to do what is necessary to take advantage of the cycles on the spiritual path. The greatest energy the person has is probably between the ages of 21 to 35, something like that. Maybe that's a reason why Christ did everything in his life by the age of 33, if the record is accurate. And because that was a period of very intense activity for the average soul. He says these cycles can be made use of everyone except the lower evolved people don't really pay any attention to cycles. They just are governed by the cycles. In other words, the energy comes into them and they just go with the flow. The DK says this is the same thing with astrological influences. Astrological influences are picked up by the average person, and he says you can use astrology quite effectively to predict what's going to happen in the life of the average person because he goes with the flow. He says when you get to a disciple with soul contact, he doesn't go with the flow. He uses the cycles. So he says using regular astrology is very difficult to make predictions of a person that has soul contact. You need to use what he calls esoteric astrology for that, astrology of the soul, to be accurate when dealing with an actual disciple. So these cycles are important for the disciple to recognize the energy that's flowing through him in his own life. Where are you at? Now, the third type of interlude, he says, is achieved and utilized during the meditation process. With this, the student must familiarize himself, for otherwise, he will be unable to work with power. This interlude, or period of intense silence, differentiates itself into two parts.
We have somebody snoring. Ken Sim seems to be snoring.
Oh, okay. Let me put him on. There we go.
And he's the only one not on mute. Yeah.
Okay.
I thought this is dog barking or something.
Yeah. Let's see if anybody else needs muted here. I have to go through here once in a while and see. Oh, everybody's pretty good shape here. Okay. The contemplation is an interlude between two activities. Contemplation corresponds, he says, to the breathing in. The first interlude corresponds to receiving inspiration from the soul. Acting upon that which is received is breathing out, followed by the second interlude of rest, waiting for the next seed. The first focuses on the soul, and the second on the mind and the brain. Okay, so as I said, the first interlude, the person breathes in, and this corresponds to the anticipation, so to speak, of the higher self. You breathe in during meditation, and you visualize yourself being linked up to the higher self. And then during the interlude, visualize yourself merging with the higher self and getting thoughts and inspiration from this higher part of yourself. Okay? And then breathe out, acting upon what you have received. Now, one thing that DK emphasizes, it doesn't do it so much in this chapter, but other places, is breathing involves more than the physical act of breath. During an actual one breath, you can't really accomplish that much. It would take a series of breaths. But looking at it from the esoteric viewpoint, the visualizing the higher self, merging with the higher self, and then bringing the inspiration down may cover a period of hours, minutes, hours, or whatever. And all these many smaller breaths constitute a larger breath. And so that's where the main focus needs to be is on this larger breath. The breathing kind of in the mind, where you visualize yourself being linked up to the higher self, and then the interlude of silence. And during this interlude of silence, you can't really hold your breath long enough to have a long enough interlude to really accomplish it. So you need to visualize a silence as if you're not even connected to your body. And in this silence, visualize yourself merging with your higher self, and then having all the thoughts and abilities that the higher self has, and bringing down inspiration that you can incorporate. And with our actual physical breath, it's kind of a duplication in miniature of the longer breaths, which are the truly successful ones. But the breath itself, the actual physical breath, is a good exercise to do this. So yeah, let's focus on this for just a minute. We'll breathe in, and he says you can actually do this in your personal life. Breathe. You might want to breathe in and out several times so that you can have plenty of oxygen in your system, and then breathe in and hold your breath for a fairly long period of time. Now, some people can hold their breath for a couple minutes, but the average person has a hard time just doing it for a minute. But we'll do it for like, just hold our breath for 20 seconds. That's a comfortable amount that we can all do. So first of all, take just a couple breaths, a couple deep breaths. Now continue breathing fairly deeply, and as you breathe in, visualize yourself rising up to the soul, to the higher self. Okay, and then during the interlude, visualize yourself being one with the soul and seeing through eyes of higher vision. Okay, continue breathing. Now breathe in and hold it for the interlude. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. 20 seconds. That seemed probably longer than 20 seconds when you're holding your breath there. Okay, let's do it one more time, and this time I won't speak anything, but we'll breathe. Okay, breathe in and out a couple times, get your breath going so you have plenty of oxygen. And when you breathe in, remember, you see yourself connecting to your higher self. Okay, breathe in now, take a deep breath, hold it for 20 seconds. See yourself as one with the soul, beginning now. Breathe out. See yourself accomplishing higher will. Okay. Anyway, these interludes are very important, and he points out the importance of try to use this in your breath throughout the day. Now, you know, breath is pretty much unconscious, but in a quiet moment, you can just breathe in, hold it, and then breathe out, and do the visualization of these interludes as throughout the day, off and on. The disciple, he says, will also use the physical breath to enhance creation. The longer the interludes, the more power generated. So you might focus a little bit on learning to hold your breath a little bit longer and see if you can get up to a minute interlude. Like say, I think some of the champions of holding their breath can go up to 7 minutes, but the average person, you know, a minute kind of taxes him.
Yeah,
So
but when you're an artist, you also have to know how to hold your tongue while you're being creative.
yeah. So anyway, don't hold your breath so long that it's painful, but hold your breath during the interludes to a comfortable amount, because when you become uncomfortable, then you can't focus your thoughts correctly. So you don't want to make yourself uncomfortable. The desired end result in using the interludes is to further the plan and assist the hierarchy. Full instruction cannot be given out to the general public, as the knowledge can be used for destructive purposes by pawns of the dark side. They specifically use this second interlude to control the lesser lives. So in this second interlude, you're supposed to take what you've received from the soul and breathe it out to control the lesser lives to accomplish what you want. Now, the dark side doesn't care about the higher will. They care about their own wills, and they use their own wills to control the elements and to bring into their lives what they want for their own purposes. Whereas the true servant breathes in through the soul and then tries to accomplish higher will and tries to direct the lesser lives, the elementals, the devas, and so on, to labor to accomplish ends in harmony with higher will. Humanity, he says, is passing through a period of great activity, physically, astrally, and mentally, caused largely by the approaching age of Aquarius. Now, if they had great activity back in 1934, imagine what he'd say about today. He'd say, well, everything's kind of intensified today. He says humanity is passing through a great interlude, and servers must keep the work progressing. We must remember that if we do not use our higher powers correctly, we could use them as they did in the days of Atlantis. In the days of Atlantis, they misused the higher powers and energies, so they lost them. Matter of fact, they lost their whole civilization. Now, this is an important interlude. We're having an interlude between the ages. The ages are approximately 2,300 years long, and we have an interlude between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. And during this period, magic happens. And so the last interlude, we had the great magic of the Christ appearing. And in this interlude, we have the great magic of all the scientific inventions, the internet, electricity, technology. And so during interludes, magical things happen. And so we're in a period of magic. So it's kind of an interesting thing to contemplate. And all the knowledge of the interludes, he says, can't be given out because they can be misused. So he just gives out the basic principles and points out that if a person is on the path, he can figure out and receive inspiration from his higher self how to use these interludes to further the work. And so he's very cautious about what he will give out, but he says eventually we'll reach a point to where more principles and details will be given out about the magical work, so that when it's safer. And we can see kind of humanity progressing, like one of the great examples I can cite was when the United States began to form. We had one state was dangerous to another state, and the fact that they had like many wars and many conflicts going on between them. But as the United States progressed, the countries became friendlier. Then they didn't have to worry so much about Illinois invading Ohio or something like that. And the same thing with Europe. France and England, Germany, always at war with each other. Now, basically, Europe is, they don't have to worry about France invading England right now. But we progress. So what was dangerous in the past will not be so dangerous in the future. And he points out a time is coming where it will be safe to give out more information about the magical work of the soul. It says misuse of the mysteries is dangerous, but so it's important that people be prepared to use them correctly. He says, you who have sensed the vision or seen a part of the intended plan should rededicate yourselves to the service of humanity. You should pledge yourselves to the work of aiding to the utmost of your ability. He says, ponder on those words and search out their significance. He says, we must work to the utmost of our ability, and all world servers should sacrifice their time and give of their money to further the endeavor of the great ones. So this is an important thing for all world servers, is to be willing to sacrifice whatever necessary to move the work forward as he sees his part of the work to be. And this one thing that he points out is everybody sees a little bit different portion and piece of the plan than others. And it's important that each person that's a dedicated disciple see the piece of the plan that he has to participate in. And when the disciple does that, he'll feel that his life has a great purpose behind it. And another important thing to realize is that with the plan, there's no really small part. It's like the saying, for the want of a nail, the kingdom was lost. For the want of maybe an obscure disciple doing his part, maybe there's a big piece of the plan that's missing. So even though you may not think that you're an important person or whatever, you may be a lot more important than you think. Maybe just doing your little piece of the plan will have a lot more effect than you can imagine. Okay, the next section will be on the prisoners of the planet, and we'll talk about that next week. Is there any comment or question before we sign off here?
I just want to go back really quick to the subject of entertainment. I believe that entertainment which we receive in past half a century is create a lot of noise. That's why people, they could not find the peace inside, we connect with our inner self, and the loneliness just increasing. So recently I read funny thing. There is no Wi-Fi in the forest, but you can get better connection. So yeah, I believe people, they lonely because the peace is throwing out of themselves. That's why the loneliness is just getting higher and higher. That's
Yeah.
my thought.
Yeah, and we're not focused enough. In the old days, there wasn't that much competition for our attention, so it was easier to focus on one or two things. Now there's so many things competing for our attention that people are having a hard time focusing. And that's one of the things that gives life purpose, is if a person focuses. You find somebody that's got a one-pointed focus and enthused about doing one thing, well, he's not depressed at all. But you find a person suffering from the shotgun effect, where you have all kinds of things competing for his attention. He wants to do, boy, there's 10 things out there that he really wants to do, and instead of picking one, he's trying to do them all, and then he winds up being frustrated. And so this is a really big problem in this generation. We got so many interesting things out there that we're not focusing on something, one or two things that can really move us in a positive direction. And this is something we have to do as disciples, is to pick the one or two things that we really need to focus on. Have a little bit of time to look at everything else out there, but just remember where your main focus is supposed to be. Okay, anything else?
Wisdom is always important. We have to,
wisdom, good judgment.
and we have to have discrimination. We have to know the more important from the less important.
Yeah, and this is a big problem we have, especially with the younger generation. All these guys walking around with their iPhones just looking at the screen all day long rather than focusing on something. Okay. Anything else?
If you know what, you know how.
Well, you're really good with one-liners, Ed. Okay. Well, we're a little bit over time. Appreciate your comments and attendance, and we will look forward to seeing you next week. All being well, will be Sunday at 2 p.m. next week. See you then.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, JJ.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.